Hey everyone, Mr. Porch here. I am just going to be explaining to you today Hegel's view of the growth of civilizations and also his view of freedom. The easiest way I have to explaining this piece in your reader, the Philosophy of History piece, is on page 50 in the 4-ish fifth paragraph, basically the last page of the reading. It says this: the history of the world travels from east to west, for Europe is absolutely the end of history. And what he means by that is there is an ideal in history, that history is moving forward, and this final aim, as he said on page 48, 3 pages before, is God's purpose in the world. This is Hegel. He is nominally a Lutheran at this time, and again, he's talking early 1800s and discussing the growth and philosophy of history throughout history. It's a very big view of history. It's the progression of freedom through history, the progression of freedom through history. So let me keep reading. The history of the world travels from east to west, for Europe is absolutely the end of history. So Europe is the most advanced in history. Asia, the beginning. So Asia is the more primitive part of history. The history of the world is the discipline of the uncontrolled natural will, bringing it into obedience to a universal principle and conferring subjective freedom. The first phase is the East. Unreflected consciousness, substantial objective spiritual existence forms the basis. In the political life of the East, we find a realized rational freedom developing itself without advancing to the subjective freedom. It is the childhood of history. So if you think of history as progressing from Asia down here at my elbow all the way up to Europe, then down here is the childhood of history, and then we progress up to Asia. So the childhood would be the East. Boyhood would be Central Asia. The Greek world, the Greeks would have grown in civilization, and they would be older people, if you will, from a child to a boy to adolescence. The Greek world would be the period of adolescence, and then the Romans would be young men. So notice on this spectrum, you're slowly getting higher as you go through, and then an older and more mature. These civilizations mark themselves as to where they're at on this spectrum. And then finally, so the Roman state was the manhood of history, so fully developed, very strong, the Roman civilization. And then finally, the German world is the old age. And that means the Europe that he's living in, Prussia that he's living in at this point in the early 1800s, that is the most mature form of civilization. This is his view of history. And so what that means is there's a spectrum, and you're either on it or you're not. So Africans, so Negroes, are like way over here. They're not even a part of the spectrum. They actually, he says earlier that they had no ability to self-govern. That is the definition of the growth of freedom in the world, is the ability to govern. So in the ancient Near East, you just had tyrants. Those were the only free people, and they tyrannically ruled over everybody. And then the Greeks, they began to do self-city states, and they were able to do some little bits of democracy, but they had still large swaths of slaves and other people who are not free. And then you hit the Romans, and that's where you begin to get broader people who are freer, right? So you notice the spectrum. This is the spectrum of growth in freedom in history. And you see it through civilization. So just as you as a little baby were not very free, as a little boy or as a little girl, you became a little bit more free. And then as a teenager, you weren't quite, you could stay out a little bit longer, right? You had a little bit more freedom. And then finally, you're going to graduate from high school eventually, maybe go off to college, maybe eventually get married. Well, these would represent the Roman stages and then the old age. And that's where you progressively get more and more free. And notice the word progressively. This is the idea where the progressives they're kind of grabbing a hold of what Hegel is talking about, the development of civilizations throughout history, and they're going to say that the U.S. is the most developed nation in the world, and specifically for the freed South, after the Civil War, we need to train them and educate all the Negroes so that they can actually learn how to self-govern. But notice that's a big difference from what Hegel's talking about here. Hegel actually thinks that Negroes and African civilizations are ahistorical. They don't even exist on the historical timeline. That's a really big deal for Hegel to be arguing that. But the progressives grab a hold of that and basically start saying, okay, Asians, if you're an Asian American, if you're from Asia, for example, Hegel would be saying you're coming from a lower matured civilization, right? Whereas if you grew up in Europe, you would be highly educated and highly civilized and highly matured on this spectrum of history, okay? So I'm just trying to fill in general, this idea that's mentioned in West on page 212, where he says, under God and religion, third paragraph, at least some of the progressives define God as human freedom achieved through the right political organization, or else God was simply rejected as a myth. For Hegel, that's him, Hegel, he's a big name for the progressives. He is not a progressive, but the progressives kind of grab a hold of his ideas and run with them in a bunch of different ways that actually aren't Hegelian, just FYI. But you're seeing some evidence of what he's talking about. And those are this reading in the packet is really important for seeing what the progressives are grabbing a hold of. Hegel, whose philosophy strongly influenced the progressives, the state is the divine idea as it exists on earth. So the state is ultimate reason. Reason is the spirit lived out in freedom on this earth. So government really exists to provide freedom for everyone, which is a very different idea than what the founders believed in terms of individuals are free, not the civilization is free. Thank you all. Hopefully that helps.